Good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for today's symposium on the historical roots of injustice in medicine. This is the first of 3 symposia in conjunction with the ongoing New England Journal of Medicine series, recognizing historical injustices in medicine and the journal. Today's topic is racism, medicine, and the journal since 1812, and we'll be discussing 4 articles that the journal has presented in recent months: slavery and the journal, reckoning with history and complicity; Indigenous Americans, the journal's historical Indian problem; explaining health inequalities, the enduring legacy of historical biases; and journal voices in the civil rights era, new horizons and limits in medical publishing. Symposia 2 and 3 will be in October and November of this year. This symposium is co-sponsored by the New England Journal of Medicine, the Center for the History of Medicine at the Countway Library, and the Office for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Partnership at Harvard Medical School. Before we begin the event, we want to acknowledge that Harvard University is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. Please note that the event today is being recorded and live closed captioning is available. We'll invite questions from the audience through Zoom after the presentations. And I'll now turn the podium over to Dr. Winfred Williams, Deputy Editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, Associate Chief of the MGH Division of Nephrology, and Founding Director of the MGH Center for Diversity and Inclusion. Dr. Williams.
Thank you, John. And you've introduced my titles. I'm Dr. Wynne Williams. I am a Deputy Editor at the New England Journal of Medicine. I'm happy to be here with you on this momentous occasion of these new symposia. I welcome you to the first in a series of symposia aimed at recognizing historical injustices in medicine and an examination of the role of the New England Journal of Medicine and how we may have played a role in promoting them. This was the brainchild of my good friend and colleague, Dr. Joan Reed, and we are happy to partner with her, Dr. Jones, and other esteemed colleagues to create these symposia. I also want to thank my colleague, Debbie Molina, for her hard work and contributions to helping organize this conference. As we acknowledged in the editorial that appeared in our April 10th edition, led by our editor-in-chief, Eric Rubin, our preamble and context for the Historical Injustices series, we recognize that the journal and other major medical journals historically have overtly or inadvertently justified or have been complicit in the mistreatment of groups based on their race, ethnicity, religion, sex or gender, or physical or mental conditions. We also understand that we live in a time when it is becoming increasingly important that we not ignore, mollify, certainly not justify, or continue to hide the painful history of injustices that we may have abetted. We believe that we, as a leading, if not the leading, academic medical journal, and clearly the oldest with a 200-year-old history, must take a lead role when it comes to acknowledging past historical injustices rendered in our pages and discovering not only the problems with that legacy, but also solutions for the future. Some have questioned, well, why do this? Why unearth a painful history, events, actions, behaviors that happened decades or even centuries ago that largely can be ascribed to the attitudes and actions prevailing back in the days of our predecessors? Why unearth this painful past? Well, I think one answer is that if what we have published and if what we endorsed in the past has led to the propagation and perpetuation of systems of social injustice and inequality based on race or other grounds, we need to do all we can to recognize these past injustices so that they're not repeated. Also, we can learn the ways in which the journal as an important pillar of health nationally and worldwide, can use lessons from the past to inform our mission to promote an understanding of how new discoveries in medicine and the application of new medical knowledge can not only eradicate disease, but also can promote health equity and social justice. Another important reason is the current backlash, I would say, taking hold in parts of this country and even in our own backyard to demonize the work of DEI, the strident and distorted critique of critical race theory, and the concomitant push to dismantle Black history. This is our lived experience, and we cannot let others dictate how we learn from and move beyond past historical realities and the lessons they teach. What errors of the past should we underscore? As an example, we can begin with the period of slavery, as we're going to do today. In their discourse on slavery, Doctors Jones, Hammond, and their historian colleagues have written eloquently to show how the history of how slavery was handled by the New England Journal of Medicine and Surgery 2 years ago is a fraught one, complicated by the common practices of the day. The widely lauded founding physicians who launched the journal, John Collins Warren and James Jackson, whose names adorn buildings at the Massachusetts General Hospital, were invested in family fortunes that tied them to goods and services provided by the very institution against which some of their close colleagues railed against. Even though these men did not own enslaved people or participate directly in the slave trade, they benefited from slavery and inherited wealth from their fathers and fathers-in-law. The authors make the point that the New England Journal of Medicine, like the New England economy, was a beneficiary of this dark institution. Among many things, Jones and colleagues highlight in their article many examples of the pseudoscience of the day, which helped support and promote racist ideology. For example, the journal published favorable reviews of Samuel Morton's Craniometry, an 1854 oration reprinted from the Buffalo Medical Journal that invoked skull capacity to argue, and I'm quoting from the text, that the doctrine that all men are created free and equal is an anatomical, a physiological, and scriptural impossibility. Morton goes on, while the mere fact of inferiority did not justify the holding of a fellow man in involuntary servitude, Africans in the Americas required paternal care and superior wisdom from white people. He says it would be impossible for 83 cubic inches of cerebral matter fed by Negro blood to compete with 92 cubic inches of the educated Teutonic brain. And of course, there's more. On a personal note, I joined the journal a little more than 3 years ago, and at that time, this was in the immediate aftermath of the murder of George Floyd in the spring of 2020. Of course, a raging public outcry ensued both nationally and internationally, which led to yet another racial reckoning in our country, both in society writ large, but also a movement that ultimately spilled over into the halls of academia and medicine. So-called racial constructs in medicine began to come into sharp focus as potentially harmful to patients of color. This discourse reached the halls of the publishing world too, and many elite publishers in medical journal circles began to look inward at the representation in their own ranks of, or lack thereof, of editors of color. I was keenly aware that what I was bringing to the table at NEJM might help guide, at least in part, a reinvigorated agenda to help bring into sharper focus and address health equity within our pages. So in my first year, we published articles that address the flaws in the racial constructs represented by estimating equations of kidney performance, equations that contain race coefficients that historically disadvantaged Black patients at the time of referral for end-stage kidney disease services. We led an effort to underscore the duty of academic medical publishers to increase the representation of diverse populations in the studies submitted to their pages, which included a new call at the NEJM for a table of representativeness in which investigators would account for the population cohorts represented in their studies, with a special emphasis on the gold standard randomized controlled trials. And finally, another example, we continued a robust publication effort centered on issues of diversity and health equity, addressing health disparities across all medical disciplines in the Perspective article series, edited by my dear colleagues, Debbie Molina, Steve Morrissey, and Jenny Pittman, who've been stalwarts in championing the efforts reinvigorated by the same national call for social justice in medicine. So have we done enough? The answer is that we can do much, much more, and the articles which provide the platform for this symposium are a robust starting point. And I thank you very much.
So, my name is David Jones. I'm a historian and physician on the faculty here at Harvard Medical School and Harvard University. And I'd like to join Joan and Lynn in welcoming you all to this symposium. And also I'd like to, again, reiterate the thanks for many people, for Joan and her team for making this event possible, for the journal, especially Wynn, Debbie, and Eric Rubin, for being willing to run this series, and then to Scott and all the other co-authors, without whose work none of this would have been possible. Now, I want to start off this session today by explaining, where this series came from, how we put it together, some of the issues that we struggled with as we were doing this, and then we'll have a series of more specific discussions of the various articles. So I could tell several different origin stories for how this series came to be. Many of the historians here, Scott, myself, Alan Brandt, who teach history of medicine at Harvard University, have long used the journal and other historical journals as resources for teaching and for research. When I was in graduate school back in the 1990s, I remember Alan Brandt, one of my teachers, would always have an assignment where you then had to do this in person. This was before anything had been digitized, but he would send 300 undergraduates from Harvard College to the basement of Countway to browse the shelves of the immense periodical collection that the library then housed, in search of articles they thought to be concerning or interesting or otherwise problematic. And then the assignment was for them to contextualize and understand this. And the goal was to show the ways in which a journal and its historical articles could reveal something important about the practice of medicine and its history and its relevance today. Now, just because of name recognition, many of those students were drawn to the New England Journal of Medicine. They had heard that name in the news, and so that's where they would go, down on L2 of this library. And over the years where we do assignments like this, I started to collect a series of really interesting and concerning articles that the students had found, thinking there was something interesting to say about this. Then I would just file them away for hopeful someday later use. And then in 2012, as part of the journal's bicentennial celebration, the journal and Massachusetts Medical Society devoted the resources needed to digitize the entire 200-year collection of this journal, which made it much, much more available for any kind of historical work. And Debbie and the editors commissioned a series of historical articles at that time to try to show off what you could do with this 200-year archive of the journal. And Scott and I worked with many other authors on that project. And our basic task there was to try to figure out, what are the greatest hits in the past 200 years? There's no easy way to do that. The journal had published about 200,000 articles by that time. Our reading was very, very selective. And we found many good articles that we just didn't have time to place. And again, I would add this to my file, interesting articles that deserve attention at some point in the future. But the most proximate origin story for this series was in April 2022, just over 2 years ago, when Harvard officially released its report on the university's legacy of slavery. Starting with one of my colleagues in the history department, I think in the early 2000s, he had begun to teach a course that sent students into the university archives to try to understand the deep entanglements of Harvard University with slavery. And over many years, that course revealed so many stories that the university eventually realized it had to do this in a more serious way, in a more public way. And so that led to the university's reports on the legacies of slavery at the university. And they kicked this off, the release of the study, with a symposium at Radcliffe Institute. And one of the speakers was Ibram Kendi from Boston University. And in his remarks, he touched just briefly on an infamous article that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine by Edward Jarvis, in which he analyzed US Census data and reached the conclusion that enslavement or slavery seemed to be good for the mental health of Africans. The rates of insanity were lower in enslaved Africans than they were in freed Africans who lived in the North. Now, Jarvis almost immediately realized there was an error, and 2 months later published a retraction and an apology. But as is so often the case, the retraction doesn't get attention. The original article stands in the public imagination. And so as I heard Kendi telling this story, I had been dimly aware of this article. It was one of the things I had come across in the past. I hadn't really recognized the significance of it. And hearing him tell that story in the context of the university's investigation of its own entanglements with slavery, I recognized there was an interesting and important opportunity to do something similar for the New England Journal of Medicine. Now, this journal, is roughly half the age of Harvard University, 212 years old at this point. But the first 50 years of that history played out at a time when slavery was legal in the United States. As Wynn had said, Boston was deeply entangled with the slave trade in various ways, and there was a lot of plantation money that enriched this city. And it wasn't too hard to imagine that the journal's publications during that 50-year period would reflect a very complicated relationship between Boston medicine and slavery. And as we dove into that, we quickly realized that it wasn't just, slavery did not end with the Civil War. Practices of slavery ended, but the legacies have continued to the present. And so I realized it might be interesting historically and valuable for the journal to do a deep dive into the journal's archive to see what was there about slavery and also a series of other topics. Again, these earlier explorations I've done in the journal's archive had made me aware that there were many different kinds of problematic issues that you'd find in a 212-year-old medical journal. We had previously come across a lot of interesting writing about eugenics, some very surprising articles about the journal's attitude towards Nazi medicine in the 1930s. My dissertation research had been about indigenous health, and again, many New England Journal of Medicine articles would feature there. And so I started to imagine a series of articles that would look at a series of different topics, use the journal as a resource to explore them, and then try to first understand what had happened, why these kinds of articles were published, and then equally importantly, what's the impact of these kinds of past publications on the institutions and theories of practices of medicine today. And so I had previously worked with Debbie on a number of different projects. So that afternoon, I pitched this idea to her, and I was very happily surprised by the quick and enthusiastic response I got from Debbie and the journal. And they said, absolutely, let's go ahead and do this. So I met with the editors, and one of the things that they insisted was that the historians who work on this would have editorial independence from the journal. And they honored that the whole way through the process. So these articles that were written were the results of our work with light copy editing from Debbie, but no impact of any journal commentary on the content themselves. The articles were peer reviewed. We responded to the reviewers, but we did have editorial independence from the journal. And I think the editors were right that it was important to maintain that. And so we ended up initially imagining a series of 6 articles about the journal's writings about slavery, about Indigenous Americans, health inequities, eugenics, Nazi medicine, and then the journal's publications during the civil rights era. Soon after, and I recruited a team of historians from different institutions and different perspectives to work on these articles with me and with Scott. We pretty quickly got a request from the journal that we should add a 7th article about women in medicine, and that many interesting things the journal had said about that. And then as the articles began to be published, we were approached by an outside group, a distinct group of historians and scholars who thought that we should do something similar to the journal's writings about gender and gender minorities in medicine. And so we quickly accepted their offer. And so now that there will be 8 articles in the series as imagined so far. The first 6 have now been published, with the last 2 to come out over this summer. Now, in terms of the actual work of writing these articles, as I alluded to earlier, to survey the journal's history is no easy task. Over 212 years, there are roughly 200,000 articles, all of which you can find from the comfort of your computer because the entire archive has been digitized. Concerning statements often come up, not often in articles that you wouldn't wouldn't be obvious from the title of the article. You have to look at the text of the articles themselves. Some of the most alarming statements were often just a throwaway comment in the middle of an article about something else. But fortunately, because of the digitization and text recognition, the journal archive is full text searchable. So you can pick your keyword and search, and you get lots and lots of hits. Now, there are obviously a lot of historical nuance on how to do that well. Relevant vocabulary has changed over time, and so you have to be savvy about the changing terminology that would show up in the medical literature if you really want to find the kinds of articles that you want. But it was relatively easy to come up with about 1,000 articles about slavery or enslaved people, about 4,000 articles on Indigenous Americans. I think that was the largest set I read through. And then plenty of articles as well about Nazis, about eugenics, and about the various civil rights controversies. So the first step in all of this was like wading through, like skimming through, 4,000 articles about American Indians and Indigenous Americans. Now, it turns out a lot of those were about India, not about American Indians. And so I think that's what you have to deal with digital history. But we went not quickly. We were able to generate lists, compile a list of probably hundreds of comments on each of these topics that deserve some kind of attention, and try to organize them by topics. For instance, the search for slavery revealed a whole series of distinct discussions, articles about the health of enslaved people, about medical care provided or imposed on them by plantation owners, about medical advocacy for abolitionism, most of which happened after abolition had already happened, the health consequences of emancipation, and many, many more. The initial drafts we produced for these articles were about 5 times as long as the published articles, 15,000 words that we winnowed down to 3,000. But that was actually a really interesting part of this process. What of this huge archive was actually the most interesting material, the most concerning material, or the things that would speak most to readers today? And we knew that we were writing for a very large audience, mostly a medical audience, but the journal's audience is much broader than just American physicians. Now, as we did that selection and finalization of these articles, we did have to deal with a really difficult issue, which was self-censorship. Some of the language that we found in the journal's archive, especially from the early 19th century, is really vile and reprehensible language. The journal published some really, really awful commentary about African Americans, Indigenous Americans, and many others. Now, my initial reaction as a historian was to say we should show it all. We should show the worst of this, both to help readers understand how deep the medical profession's issue with racism and other forms of discrimination is. And also, we didn't want to be accused of sweeping the worst of the stuff under the carpet. If we published one set of articles and someone found a whole lot of more alarming stuff that we had ignored, that would potentially be a problem. However, I was swayed by the arguments of my colleagues that there are some language from the 19th century that simply should not be reprinted in one of the world's most prominent medical journals in the 21st century. There is language that readers would have found saddening, angering, deeply offensive, or who knows how else people might have reacted to some of this awful language. And we spent a lot of time discussing this, but decided in the end that there was some language that we just were not going to quote in our articles. What we did is when that came up, is generally we make a comment in the text, like this article had really vile language, and the citation is there. And so if someone really wants to see what that horrible, vile language was, the journal is available online for anyone who has access and wants to read through. So the language is there. Again, as I said, it was a difficult decision to make as a historian, but I think we made the right decision about that in the end. And then we also know that our work on this series was necessarily incomplete. We had initially planned 6 articles. We've expanded that to 8 articles, but this is incomplete in many ways. This question of the medical professions, even the Boston medical professions' relations to slavery before the Civil War, could easily fill a whole book. This is an enormous and complicated and interesting topic. And we were given roughly 2,500 words, which we were allowed to stretch a little bit, but these were very limited length articles. And so a lot of the materials that said earlier that we had found, we simply just could not include. So there's much more to be said about any one of the topics that we have covered. And we also didn't cover every possible topic. the journal is full of surprising and problematic things said about Jewish people, about Muslim people, about Hispanics, about Chinese Americans, about Mexican Americans. There's no limit to the list of searches you could do that would reveal a set of concerning articles that could be fruitfully analyzed to produce an analogous set of articles to the ones that we have published. So this is not meant to be the last word on this subject. This is very much a demonstration of the kind of work that can be done, the kind of work that needs to be done, and also a demonstration of the journal's willingness to do this kind of work. As I said, the last of the articles in the series planned so far about gender minorities was a response from other authors who read the series and said, "You're missing something. We can fill that hole." And the journal was willing to accept that offer. And so we hope and expect that other authors will continue to do this work, fill in the gaps we had, which we are aware of, whether those other articles get published in the New England Journal of Medicine or get published elsewhere. That will just depend on what other authors want to do and how journals want to engage with this. But there is a lot more that could be said, different topics. The last thing I will say is that our series was limited deliberately to the New England Journal of Medicine. We have a few quotations from other sources where it was necessary to fill in a gap, but this was really a targeted analysis of this one journal, of this institution, and its very long history. And so, yes, it's a narrow approach, it's a parochial approach. There are many different approaches that could be done. But the choice is justifiable in many different ways. The journal is the longest continuously published medical journal in the world right now, so it provides the longest archive for historians who want to do this kind of time series analysis of how medical theory and practice changed. It wasn't the most important medical journal in the US in the 19th century. That was probably the American Journal of Medical Sciences. It wasn't the most important US journal in the first half of the 20th century. That probably would have been the Journal of the American Medical Association. But through some very clever marketing that really began during World War II, where the journal distributed free copies to all physicians serving in the US military during the war. And I have found accounts in the archives of Boston physicians stationed on the Anzio Beach holding journal clubs while under German artillery fire, reading the articles from the latest issue, probably not the latest, no delay, but reading what had been published in the New England Journal of Medicine while they were serving in the army in Africa and Italy. And so a generation of doctors returned from the war accustomed to reading this journal, and it now has gained the enormous influence that it has. And so I think the journal does justify the kind of attention that we have given it. Now you could say, these articles, especially the ones you'll hear about in this first panel, were really Boston-centric. In the early 19th century, it was the New England or the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal. Most of the original material that they published was published by Boston physicians. It's a really parochial journal. That said, it was an important node. It published republished a whole lot of articles that had appeared in other medical journals in Europe and the US. Its journals, in turn, were republished in other journals throughout the United States. So it does provide a valuable glimpse into what was happening in medicine more broadly throughout this country and secondarily throughout the world. The articles are very much specific to the context in which they were written, but there are many ways that they still speak to us today. And they raise many questions that remain relevant, and that's what we'll be talking about now. And so we really hope that the authors live up to the promise, that the articles live up to the promise of this project. We realize there is much more that can be done, and we hope that it will be done. And so this should be seen as just the start of a conversation. So what we'll do is we'll turn it over to a panel discussion for some of the authors who worked on the first two articles about slavery and indigenous Americans, to give you a sense of what was involved in doing this kind of work, how we put these articles together, and also to talk about some of the specific things that were most interesting to us as authors. Joined in person by three of the co-authors, Megan Kerr, Scott Podolsky, and Joe Gone. And then online we have Evelyn Hammonds, who happily can hear and waved. And so I'll allow each of them to say something in turn. We'll start with Megan.
So one question that followed directly from the Harvard and Legacy of Slavery initiative was, what ties do the journal have, the founding physicians have, to slavery, which was deeply embedded in the Boston economy? Is it okay? Okay, sorry. So as Dr. Williams already said, the founders of the journal and of HMS did not enslave any individuals themselves, but nonetheless, there were entanglements embedded in their family histories. So in retrospect, this really shouldn't have been a surprise. Although some of the founders opposed slavery, like so many prominent Bostonians, they came from these New England families with historical ties to slavery and the triangular trade. So the journal co-founder, John Collins Warren, he was the grandson of John Collins. John Collins was the governor of Rhode Island from 1786 to 1790. He, based on census data between 1774 and 1790, he had in his household 13 enslaved individuals, and that was a consistent number throughout the census. And when Collins died in 1795, he left to his daughter Abigail money and an individual named Quaco, who's an enslaved boy. So when Abigail Collins and John Warren Sr. married in 1777, we're unsure of what happened to Quaco. That's one of the things we're looking into right now, is to find out if he indeed did come to Massachusetts in 1795 and what happened to that individual. Additionally, John Warren Sr. was an investor in the Middlesex Canal. The canal provided a continuous water route between Boston and Concord, New Hampshire. And so this allowed for the flow of the shipment of sugar, molasses, cotton, all things that are commodities that are tied directly to the triangular trade and plantation slavery. So the Collins family history is important to this narrative because ultimately John Warren Sr. gave John Collins Warren money and property when he died in 1815. The journal's other co-founder, James Jackson, was the son of a Newburyport merchant, Jonathan Jackson, and he shipped rum during his career, and he also at one point owned enslaved individuals. James was also the grandson of Patrick Tracy, a prominent merchant, and he also owned enslaved individuals. So James Jackson did inherit money and property as well by tracing the probate records from his father and grandfather. Walter Channing, who worked closely with Warren and Jackson for the journal, and he strongly opposed slavery, came from a wealthy Newport, Rhode Island family that is directly tied to slavery. And his grandfather, John Channing, was co-owner of a ship called the Elizabeth that left Newport in 1753 and ultimately enslaved 70 individuals during that journey. And in addition, Walter Channing's education was paid for by his uncle, also named Walter Channing. And his uncle was a co-owner of a ship called the Eagle, which left Rhode Island in 1802 and enslaved 95 individuals. So much of this research really was conducted during the early stages of the pandemic. So it was all digitized resources at that point. I looked at American ancestors for all the probate files. I tried to trace money and see where people were given things over time. I also consulted certain digitized secondary resources that Harvard made available during the pandemic, including Christopher Roberts' 1938 book about the canal, and also Jay Coftree's 1981 book about Rhode Island and the slave trade. So this research is ongoing. I'm in the process of consulting archival resources that are now available that weren't 4 years ago, specifically about Warren, the Collins family, hoping to visit some repositories in Newport to get a better idea of the connections. And we also have a history of science graduate student, Caitlin Smith, who is doing some work investigating the initial findings that we came up with in the HMS and slavery report, and to see what else we can find and kind of navigate in the future. So there's more to come, and we'll have more to share in the future about what we uncover.
Thanks. So I'm Scott Podolsky. I've had the honor of getting to work with Meg and Caitlin, along with our colleague Dominic Hall, on this history of those direct entanglements with slavery. But I'd like to shift now and place the findings from our series in the context of the central yet evolving role of the medical journal more generally in American medicine over the past 2 centuries. NEJM, as David mentioned, is the longest surviving medical journal in the world, but it wasn't the first in the US. That was New York's Medical Repository, founded in 1797. Before the Civil War, there was a real desire among American physicians to craft a distinctly American brand of medicine. To answer the snarky European comment, quote, "In the 4 quarters of the globe, who reads an American book or goes to an American play? What does the world yet owe to American physicians or surgeons?" Unquote. One response to this was a desire to found journals. with NEJM a key representative of an impressive proliferation of medical journals, with over 500 having been formed in the US by the 1880s. Many of these were written for their immediate community, often representing the viewpoints of particular medical schools or sects, and many were characterized by their high infant mortality rates. But some, like NEJM, or as it was called from 1828 to 1928, the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, were long-lasting. And there was an aspiration to forge these into a national medical literature. In fact, when the American Medical Association itself formed in 1847, it focused in part on this national journal literature, decades before the advent of JAMA itself in 1883. One way this national medical identity manifested was by the frequent sharing of articles. A substantial share of early NEJM consisted of reprints from other medical journals, many from England or Europe, as David mentioned, and we've previously called this an early phase of translational medicine. But many of these reprinted articles derived from throughout the US, including Southern medical journals and Southern authors, notably including Josiah Nott, Samuel Morton, and Samuel Cartwright, all of whose articles came up through our searches. These aspirations to a national medical identity and a national medical literature converged on the subject of race. American physicians were seemingly able to contribute to the novel science of racial distinctions and hierarchies, the American school of ethnology, in part because of the population of enslaved Africans in the US. And they would in turn be able to create a national discourse about race, which they did by circulating articles throughout the US medical literature. They did so notably, even as North-South tensions deepened in the 1840s and 1850s. Journals like the AMA became a space to hold the brotherhood of medicine together, and in turn to seemingly help hold the country together. So amidst this background, and from our searching, the findings across the slavery and indigenous peoples articles had several shared themes, yet their own unique characteristics. And so I'll speak first about the slavery article. And some of these terms are, well, you'll hear are difficult. With respect to using keywords like Negro and slavery to trace the shared histories of scientific racism and slavery in the journal, we noted, one, the ubiquity and seeming banality of terms of distinction or difference like Negro, with well over 2,000 uses of that term alone, continuing in this fashion through the 1980s. Two, such medical accounts of difference routinely translated in the antebellum era into hierarchies and notions of white supremacy, as demonstrated, as David had mentioned, by repeated discussions of craniometry. Three, medical discussions of the care of the enslaved frequently centered on their utility, namely restoring a sick enslaved person to value, which could mean capacity for either physical or reproductive labor. Four, in the antebellum era, beyond reprints, we found a variety of efforts to foster a sense of national professional unity. For example, by publishing travelogues of Northern physicians who went south to meet prominent Southern physicians and see sites of local interest, including slave markets. Five, along these lines, and frankly to our initial surprise, we found no significant political mention of slavery or abolition throughout the 1850s. And we looked hard, and we cited the absolutely apolitical discussion of Charles Sumner's injuries sustained after his caning in Congress to drive home this point. And six, post-Civil War, we then found revisionist histories with biographies of physicians like Henry Bowditch celebrating their advocacy for abolitionism. Yet for the most part, the articles in the journal demonstrated enduring attention to difference and its implications. For example, Jarvis's findings on slavery and insanity continue to be cited amidst other evidence to support the notion that slavery had protected enslaved people from insanity and TB. And in all this, I've long been guided by Evelyn Hammond, so I get to turn over now.
So thank you, Scott. I mean, I think that you've made the major points we were trying to get across, and I just want to reiterate a couple of them, and then I'll have more to say in the next part of our conversation. And that is this idea of creating a national story, a national sort of community of physicians, I think is a really critical one for people to understand, because I think a question often comes up about whether or not, about why the New England Journal, located in New England, has had these kinds of articles in it. And therefore, really, I think it's important that we emphasize that this creation of a kind of national community of physicians amidst, albeit amidst a great deal of work and attention that was being paid campaign in the medical community about creating communities of regulated physicians, licensed physicians, all of those kinds of things were happening as well. But this part, I think, speaks to that there is something that I found surprising as we were going through this, of a sense that slavery was not so much a local problem. It's not so much owned by Southern physicians who had the greatest access to the enslaved peoples, but that is something that represented a question, a set of issues that had national import. And so I think that's one part of the answer to why the editors were willing to reprint articles from the American Journal of Science, Medical Sciences, which in fact had printed some of the work of some of the most notorious physicians involved in medical experimentation, for example. And therefore, if as you're creating this sort of national conversation, that it really frames, I think, quite seriously the fact that slavery is a national problem and not simply a local problem. And I think that has had deep and lasting impact on the practice of medicine, beginning in this period and moving forward well into the 20th century. I also want to highlight the point you made about the use of certain terms that go into the 1980s. Actually goes, I think, a little bit further than the 1980s, because it took a while before the National Library of Medicine began to actually try to re-index many of the articles that were using terms that are pretty, as David noted, pretty difficult and really at odds with modern usage of descriptive terms of peoples of color.
Excellent. Then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Joe Goen, who was one of the co-authors on the Indigenous American piece. And after Joe's comments, we will open up for a 10-minute Q&A.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it. I switched microphones because it looked like it was dying here. I appreciate the reference to the national story. And as I think about the national story that we must tell, it's premised really on the foundations of stolen African labor and stolen Indian land. And in some ways, that's the structure that we're following today as we present on some of these issues. So I want to talk to you a bit about our article, Indigenous Americans, the Journal's Historical Indian Problem. And if you're at all familiar with federal Indian affairs, the Indian problem refers to the fact that you have a dispossessed population that's been confined into poverty on reservations, and the federal government doesn't know what to do with us for a long period of time. And so that's what we're referring to in the title here. I happen to be the faculty director of the Harvard University Native American program, which has been existing for about 53 years at this point. And we have perhaps 30 who will graduate at our commencement, which we celebrate with Indigenous, Native American, and others coming up next month. And at least 2 of those will be HMS students. So we're pleased and proud to have folks coming through medicine here. One of the traditions that we observe our commencement speeches, of course, both from keynote addresses as well as from each of the graduates. We have a chance to say something at these commencement exercises they like. And often what you'll find in these is that the Indigenous keynote addresses and or student speeches will start off in an Indigenous language, and they'll introduce themselves and they say a few words. Most of us can't understand what they're saying exactly. They often will tell us. But the point is that there's an immense commitment to language revitalization that happens that's on display in these kinds of careful events. And so language is very important. And it reminded me of one of the instances we record here in our article from 1845, a report in the journal that states the following. I'll just read it for you to give you an example of the kinds of coverage that we have. It's about a graduation feast at Geneva Medical College, which included a speech by Dr. Wow Wawa Naonk.
Geneva, New York.
Thank you. Yes. A Seneca Indian chief and a, quote, educated physician who offered his address in his native language. And so what does the journal editorialist note about this? Well, he writes, quote, must have been vastly edifying to a company of gentlemen who never heard a word of that dialect before. However, it was capital talk, and all the better for not being understood. So in our review, we had opportunity to canvass the kinds of editorial remarks such as that one, some actually quite a bit worse in terms of what they had to say. David already mentioned that there were some 4,000 articles that mentioned Indigenous stuff. And so winnowing that down was really important. We got it to 212 relevant articles. We spent some time trying to take a look at. And I remember, David, when you sent me the first sort of draft of this, it was 50 single-spaced pages of material that we had to sort of winnow down. One thing that we did was to, with some support, get some word clouds of 25-year increments to get a better sense for what was important. So those are in the article in a way that I think it's really helpful. There were some really key themes that we kind of summarized at the outset, savagery and civilization, and lots of words about rude barbarism and things like this concerning Indigenous peoples, versus also sometimes a romanticization of Indigenous life as maybe protective from the vulnerabilities of civilization. A kind of focus on Indigenous medicines. We have a reference to Saratoga Springs, which was claimed by some Indian people to be beneficial, but that the physicians were kind of attracted to that and interested in it, or the medicinal properties of sage. Susceptibility to epidemics is a big one, in terms of whether it's smallpox, tuberculosis, cholera, malaria, COVID more recently, or, substances like alcohol, and a lot of concern and consideration around, this racial, often framed as a racial vulnerability, et cetera. And of course, with the extinction of Native people, and that often couched in terms of social Darwinism, like survival of the fittest. And so really what we have here in the history of the New England Journal of Medicine and Indigenous peoples is a catalog of scientific and medical racism, particularly for the first 150 years or so. And the assumption, as was common in society, that Native peoples were a vanishing race. In fact, we term this here in recognition of reservations, quote, as palliative care for a dying race, in terms of how people were representing Native and Indigenous issues. So we look especially at that, the preponderance of that history. I think we find really what we might term white man fantasies of Indigenous inferiority and European and Euro-American superiority. And all of this is part and parcel of the dynamics of settler colonialism. We know about colonialism: outsiders arrive, they extract, they control, maybe they're forced to leave in decolonial fashion. Settler colonialism is a little different, because people arrive, dispossess, remove, settle with no intent of leaving, and probably never will leave, and therefore must erase. Erasure becomes important for settler colonial dynamics, because how do you tell a national story that's feel good and that motivates and mobilizes the citizenry and population if it's premised on stolen African labor and stolen Indian land? And so we get entangled in the politics of representation very deeply relative to this erasure that is part and parcel of the dynamics of settler colonialism. And the politics of representation play out in a journal like the New England Journal of Medicine. And so in summary, I would say that what we are witness to in this summary is an article that we prepared is a century and a half of slander in service to the legitimacy of the US nation state. And I think it allows us to observe, along with Jim Waldron, who's a psychologist and anthropologist at the University of Saskatchewan, who really did a review of Native representations of mental health concerns and considerations, which he called Revenge of the Wendigo. And there was this, that turns out fictive condition called Wendigo psychosis that psychiatrists who were quite enamored with Indigenous difference talked a lot about early on. But what Waldron traces, there never was any such thing. It was a white man fantasy. And so I think what we want to appreciate here is that when we read this history, particularly the first 150 years of the journal about Indigenous Americans, it tells us much more about white Americans than about Indigenous Americans. Now, let me pause here and say some more in a bit at the next panel. So thanks.
Okay, so we now have time. I probably stand up so I can see better. We now have time, about 10 minutes or so, to open up the floor for questions about any aspects of this, why we did this, how we did this, or questions about the articles we've been discussing about Indigenous Americans and slavery. Yes.
Hello, my name is Azariah Boyd. I'm a master's student at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. Thank you all for being here. I really enjoyed your final comment, actually, and it's been something that I've been thinking about a lot when I try to understand the history of racism and environmental justice, which is sort of my field. And it's this point of whiteness and how we spend a lot of our time exploring the marginalized communities and the historical injustices that have been done on marginalized communities. And we end up finding starking disparities all the time. However, we never really explore sort of whiteness as it is a culture and as it has sort of produced a lot of these things, which can, I think, be reckoning in a way where we explore whiteness more and how it operates in the society in which we live. And so are there any plans to incorporate that into the studies? Because we do see that these disparities are very connected. And it's not just one, and a lot of times we think that it's just, you know, the stories of Indigenous people or it's the stories of Black people, but no, we've existed together, right? And so how has whiteness shaped what we have today as a society? And are there any plans to sort of tackle that more directly and have more scholarly papers come out about that? Thank you.
Do you want to say more about the?
Sorry, we've got out of
Hold
power.
on.
Thanks. I'll just say briefly that first of all, I think it would be fantastic to have a paper that talks about whiteness as represented in the history of NEJM or other bodies of literature, because I think you're right that it's really important to appreciate those politics of representation and the dynamics that shape them. I'll just say that Euro-American white identity partakes of a very interesting dynamic that shapes the politics of representation, which are, as I was going to say in a bit, that Native peoples are simultaneously everywhere and nowhere in America. That is, we have these historical representations or often misrepresentations that are on every street corner and on every map you see and sports teams, mascots, and what have you, that represent us in ways that are skewed or historical or often stereotypical. And yet living Native people are almost never represented in ways that most people ever encounter or know or talk to. And so those dynamics mean it's curious, why not erase entirely? Why keep alive even the historical stuff? And that's because Europeans who arrived in America want to become indigenous to this land and this hemisphere. And so telling a story that identifies with Native people is important for having an American identity in ways that I think explain this a bit. One of the challenges of that, of course, is that we have a whole problem with pretendians, as we refer to them, which are, you know, basically white people who decide through real or distant imagined ancestry that they in fact are Native, and they increasingly identify as Native and then sometimes take center stage in society as Native people until they're outed or exposed or declared as frauds by other folks. So it's weird dynamics that pretty much definitely warrant good analysis.
And I'll just add one quick comment. The ways in which that plays out in language is really interesting. The whiteness is often referred to in distinction or constructed in distinction to the other groups that they were writing about. And so you could do a very interesting analysis of subtleties of language. So you'd find articles where they would talk about comparing women from the different races, and they talk about white women or white females, and then Black or Indigenous. They wouldn't use male or female. They'd use other terms, which I'm not going to repeat here. But even that binary is so embedded in how the whiteness was constructed in distinction to these other groups. And that was just pervasive the whole way through. Nancy.
Nancy Krieger, School of Public Health. So first, I just want to say a huge thank you that this series exists. I assign topics in my classes that are tied to many of these things, and to have these short articles as resources that I can add to my syllabus, which I've already done, is just really enormously beneficial. So I just want to say a huge thank you for that, and thinking about this as a teaching tool that goes well beyond the readership of the journal to what we can put in our classroom. So I just want to start there. But then I also am struck thinking about that this title is Historical Roots of Injustice in Medicine, and tying on your comments, Joseph Bone, about land and labor being very important. Are you thinking about including as topics, not things that are just seen as properties of people, wrongly so, for example, racialized identities, sexualities, et cetera, but also looking at issues of land and labor, specifically in relation to occupational history and occupational health, looking at environmental health, tied to your concerns, Azariah, about environmental injustice, looking at the questions of conquest and imperialism and colonialism and the framings of what now gets called global health. It seems to me if you're going to go to historical roots of injustice, dealing with these fundamental issues of land and labor and wealth is really crucial, and not just about the representations of individuals and what they then embody that becomes their health characteristics. And I'm very aware that, for example, our colleague David Rosner is about to publish a book on building the world that kills us. That really is a history combined of occupational and environmental health in the United States, tied also obviously to climate, that looks at the power relations that go into this creation of worlds that kill people and who benefits from them. So I just would wonder if there's a way to bring that and not only have it be framed as an identity framing of who has been marginalized and who has been harmed, but actually looking at who's behind that in terms of ultimately economic and political interests at play.
There's certainly an enormous amount you could do on that question of occupational health, which in the US was almost always racialized. I've been working on a separate project on the history of heat wave mortality and how that manifests in the medical literature. And in Boston, the early discourses of heat stroke are almost entirely focused on Irish immigrants. They were the ones who were dying most often from heat stroke. And half the story was about, these people came from cold, dreary Ireland and can't tolerate Boston summers. But the other half of it was also that these people were given horrible jobs. They were working in the sugar refineries and the laundries for men and women, respectively. And so they were left to labor in the most insufferably hot and humid environments in the city, and it was killing them. And you'll see those observations, but what you don't see is what we would hope that doctors would do, which would then call that out and condemn it. And so there'd be very interesting work you could do along those lines. I had toyed with the idea of doing an article about representations of capitalism and other forms of politics and economy. And there's a lot of material, as you can imagine, especially about the great bugaboo of socialized medicine. And one of the things that showed up, when you do a search for slavery, most of the hits in the 20th century are actually about cranky white physicians talking about how they have been enslaved by government medicine, socialized medicine, now insurance companies. And so they appropriate this discourse of enslavement as if somehow they are the ones that have been enslaved. And so there's a very interesting analysis that you could do with that. And so Evelyn, if you have something you want to chime in, just raise your hand or wave madly and I'll give you a chance to talk.
Okay, I guess there was just one point I wanted to make following the first question about whiteness. There is definitely a need to do a particular reading of many of the all of the articles that we have in the piece on in the first article on slavery that really takes apart and helps people understand this comparative project that was constantly going. We see over and over and over in these articles, whites are like this, blacks are like this, indigenous peoples are like that. But what we've forgotten in some of our analysis is the constant creation of the white body in comparison to other bodies. What we leave out, because people are sort of maybe taking more of the white perspective, the fact that that white body, that normalized body, that norm is totally dependent on how the Black body and the indigenous body is characterized. You can't have one without the other. It's understanding racial difference as an analogical project, a relational project that constantly constructs all these categories together. And that helps you tell a slightly different story about the focus that was very, very much a part of the 19th century articles that have that particular lens. So, and then I guess the end of that story would be this: white people's greater health status or improvement of their health status over time from the 19th century to the present is totally dependent on the disenfranchisement of other people. So it's not just about identity, but it is actually fundamentally about the fact that the health improvement of whites was totally dependent on the lack of improvement of other groups.
Yeah, there are a couple questions online. I do want, well, we are delighted that we filled the room, which is always a good thing when you're organizing a workshop like this. We also have a larger audience online, so we've gotten a couple questions coming in from there. One anonymous attendee asks, what pushback, if any, have you received from those who are exposing the flaws, from those who think that exposing the flaws of the past are somehow unpatriotic? And how have we responded? I think that anxiety was sort of front and center in my mind, and I think on Debbie's mind as well, back in December when the first article published. Any of you who have been following the politics of history in this country are aware of things like the 1619 Project, which tried to focus attention on the ways in which this country has been a country built on and influenced by slavery throughout its history. And then the furious pushback that has gotten, things like by acknowledging the role that slave interests played in the Revolutionary War is somehow unpatriotic, or by focusing attention on the fact that most of the celebrated founders owned slaves, that takes away from their great accomplishments. So that is very much part of the discussion of history and politics in the US today. And so I was certainly worried that we were going to get articles or letters or complaints or anything that can happen on social media saying, why were we attacking this journal? Don't we understand that American medicine has the best healthcare system in the world? And lots of things get said. And why are we doing this? And why are we trying to tear down this great celebration of American medicine? And oddly enough, even though I've been looking, I haven't seen anything like that.
That's because you don't get to please you might. We've gotten very.
Yeah, and you'll hear more from Eric Rubin, the journal's editor, in the end of the session. But the journal certainly has readers who are not shy about sending in complaints about articles. I have received some, and they definitely happen. And I don't know why we haven't gotten more of those. It could be an issue of readership or audience. It could be that the people who are inclined to think those things aren't even going to read the articles to begin with because they just see the title and like, I'm not going to deal with that crazy woke people. So I don't know. We'll talk some more about the end. We have gotten questions about why didn't we cover this or why didn't we cover that, and that's why I said at the beginning. This was very much seen as a incomplete effort to do this. And we'll have other panels about this series coming up in the fall that will explore some of the articles that we're not talking about today. But as everyone's aware, there are many issues happening in the world now that are worthy of attention and discussion. And when we published the article recently about the journal's silence about Nazi medicine, which was in dramatic distinction to JAMA, which published a lot about what the Germans were up to in the 1930s. So we comment on erasures, and whenever you do that, then you're going to get letters saying, well, what's the journal ignoring now? And there has been commentary online about the kinds of issues that the journal hasn't been giving attention to, but I think that's inevitable. But so far, I think people have been very appreciative of the journal's willingness to do this. The comment I've gotten most frequently from my historian colleagues is, how on earth did you convince the journal to do this? What's in it for them to run these articles about the skeletons in its closet? I said it wasn't hard at all. I pitched the idea and it was immediately recognized that this would be something that'd be useful to do. And so most of the response that I have seen has been favorable. And then there's another question from online. What's the best strategy to address the ways in which the historical injustices have precipitated health inequities in the modern day? And I think that is an excellent question to use to pivot to the second panel. Which will focus on that. So thank you for the first round of speakers. And the way we structured our thinking about this is this initial discussion is about how the series was put together and some of the basic issues that we came across, which you've now heard. What we want to do now is take about 20 or 25 minutes or so to think about this much more in terms of what we see as the modern legacies and relevance of this. As the question asked about, what's the relationship between these histories and either the health inequities that exist today or the kind of racialized discourse that persists today. And so some of the speakers on this panel you've already met. Joe Gone will kick us off talking about his take on how he sees this history of Indigenous Americans relevant for Indigenous health today. Evelyn Hammonds will talk about some of the historical legacies of the kinds of explanations of health inequities that have been given. We did the third article, after the articles about slavery and Indigenous Americans, we had a third article that was more of a conceptual article about this idea of health inequities and how have they been explained. And Evelyn worked with Joe and me and with David Williams, who could not be here on that article. And then the sixth article, and it was written by Merlin Takwanian, who's a historian of medicine and public health at Columbia University. He had done a lot of work on medicine in the civil rights era. And so when I was, again, it's hard not to have come across some of the really stunning things this journal published on both sides of the issue during the civil rights era. Some of you may have been at a symposium that we did in 2019 about Harvard Medical School's celebrating 50 years of affirmative action at Harvard. And it brought back many African-American alums who, the minute they found out I was a historian, were more than happy to tell stories about what they remembered about training in the late 60s, early 70s, and the kinds of stuff they had to deal with. Some of it was the kind of stuff that was getting published in medical journals in the Boston Globe, what have you. And so we knew we had to do something about civil rights. And so Merlin was an excellent choice to write about that, because he knew the broader historical contexts and that he could explain where the journal's interventions were coming from. So that I will turn it over to Joe.
Well, thanks, and hi again. It occurs to me at the outset here, I should maybe explain something. Of course, as we've said, that Indigenous peoples in the United States are heirs to the colonial legacy, which shapes us in all kinds of ways. One way it shaped me and my lineage is through my surname. So my surname is the English word gone. And I actually, my family and people are from the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation in north central Montana. On my dad's side, it's the Azure and Brisboe families. On my mom's side, it's the Gone and the Crazy families. I carry my mom's surname, and I always say, as a psychologist, it's a good thing she didn't hyphenate her last names, or it'd be a psychologist named Dr. Gone Crazy. But it is the English word gone because my great-grandfather was sent to a federal Indian boarding school at the age of 5 years old in 1891 at Fort Belknap Agency. And the custom at that time was to take new Indian kids and give them, an American name. And the way you did that was to take their father's Indian name and make that the surname. And so his father's Indian name translated as Gone to War, which they just clipped to Gone. And so he became Freddie Gone and the progenitor of the Gone family at Fort Belknap. And so my last name is the English word Gone. Let me just pick up where I left off to talk a bit about, our review as it's brought a little more up to date. I was really speaking in the last session about the first 150 years or so. Even as early as 1910, however, we note how the Indian birth rate was reported in the journal as exceeding the death rate. And so this idea about the vanishing Indian started to, lose some of its salience. And also there were some articles and attention to the rise of the Indian medical service, because on reservations, which I can assure you are not conducive to good health and well-being, it was necessary to try and attenuate some of the most egregious suffering that happened even into the late in the 20th century. The biggest transition, I suppose, is the Red Power movement of the 1970s, since this next article is kind of about civil rights. The Red Power movement emerged out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, as often as the place that was said to have emerged. And like Black civil rights, partook of people advocating for broader inclusion and recognition in society, albeit for Native peoples, it was about treaties and treaty making. Because most indigenous nations have treaties with either the European powers or the United States. And these treaties, of course, are binding agreements nation to nation, which means that Indian polities are recognized as sovereign nations. We are nations within a nation. There's no other group in the world that occupies the kind of weird legal and political status that Indian nations do. And so the rise of sovereign tribal nations, the recognition and respect that is accorded for that became important. And it really culminated in 1975, and as we talk about in the Indigenous article, the Indian Education and Self-Determination Act, which kind of recognized the national sovereign status and which allowed for tribal nations to take over federal programs with federal dollars and administer them themselves. This has been elaborated since 1975 to allow for what is called self-governance compacts, which tribal nations can just take over all of the federal programs and all of the federal dollars and run our own clinics, our own hospitals, our own medical systems. And so because of that possibility, probably like nowhere else in America, there is possibility for innovation in health and mental health care, since I focus on mental health stuff. There has been concomitantly a rise in American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian physicians. According to recent statistics, there are over 2,500 active Native and Indigenous physicians in America today. That represents 0.3% of the physician workforce, even though we're, as Indigenous peoples, 1.7% of the US population, so still quite deeply underrepresented. And this is probably one of the biggest battles that we contend with now, is a greater physician workforce is needed to help to remedy the health issues of Native peoples. In the journal, there was a perspective by the Lakota physician Yvette Rubidoux in 2005. It talked about her efforts to try to work in Indian country around health issues, and which really tried to shift the explanation of these health inequities to the social determinants of health, which has been a long kind of running back and forth in the journal about how much to think about things like heredity and biology and vulnerability of race versus social determinants and structural inequities. Indian health today remains really compromised. We have persistent inequities in all kinds of domains. I, of course, focus on the mental health domain, in which we have high rates of addiction, trauma, suicide. The services, however, which are on offer through the Indian Health Service, or funded by the Indian Health Service, or in other domains, are deeply underfunded. I think when I started my career, it was said that maybe federal allocations for Indian health were about 40 cents on the dollar compared to what the federal government would pay for like healthcare for its workforce. I think that's risen a bit. Last figure I saw was maybe 60 cents on the dollar. But the point is, we're trying to do an awful lot with very little, and you can't always get blood from a turnip. We've been characterized, I think, since self-determination with increasing tribal control over health and healthcare, whether it's this program or that program or the entire system on our reservations. And we've also seen a great deal of pride and attention since the Red Power movement to looking to our tradition and to reclaiming and revitalizing some of our traditions, including therapeutic traditions. And so there's a great deal of interest in Indian country on holistic health and healing, on incorporating medicine people and traditional healers into the health services that we offer. And of course, under tribal control, that has prospects that may not be equated in systems off reservation or outside of tribal control. We continue to have ongoing battles over representation, of course. And so really, as I mentioned already, in terms of contemporary representations, we're simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. One way in which we're nowhere relative to some of the major discourses that proliferate in American society about health have been in the discourse of deaths of despair, which have been typically attributed to the white working class in America who have lost livelihood and are suffering from premature death due to liver disease and overdose and suicide and those sorts of things. The only reason you can tell that story in such a compelling way that captures mass media attention is because you have erased data about Native peoples. Actually, American Indian people suffer more extremely from deaths of despair if you were to look at those statistics, but those statistics are just not as widely available or widely reported. And so that's an instance of erasure that overlooks something very important that we need to attend to. In terms of being represented everywhere, probably the biggest that we're most aware of are sports teams' mascots. There's been a big battle, and of course, the Washington Redskins no longer exist in that way. And yet, thousands and thousands of American high schools still have stereotypical caricature sorts of mascots. And we know scientifically some of the work that Stephanie Freiberg, as a psychologist colleague, and others of us have contributed to in minor ways, limit Indigenous aspirations and horizons. Exposure to mascots have been shown experimentally for Indian students to cut off their ability to imagine a future in which they're pursuing higher education and thriving in a career. And obviously then this helps to support and facilitate a very leaky pipeline to higher education and to medical school and beyond. As I want to conclude today, I guess the question that's on my mind is, given the long history of what we've uncovered in the New England Journal of Medicine relative to Indigenous peoples, what does remedy and repair look like for a journal such as the New England Journal of Medicine that has promoted systematic slander and denigration for so long? the series is a promising start, but I think only a start. Thanks.
Evelyn.
So, thanks. At this point, I was asked to sort of address the question that has emerged. Ever since projects like the one we've been involved in here with the New England Journal, ever since these projects have been coming out, one question is continually asked: what is the significance of what happened in the period of slavery for today? And in this case, what is the significance of what was reported in the New England Journal during the period of slavery for the history of medicine? And I would include history of medical education today. So I think one of the reasons that question continues to be raised for this kind of project is because many Americans simply don't know enough about what happened in slavery, what slavery, the whole institution was about, and its impact on broader American life. So when the great American historian Ira Berlin was president of the American Historical Association over 20 years ago, he noted the following about this very question. And he asked, he said, first, that slavery has a greater presence in American life actually now than at any time since the Civil War period. And he was writing in 2001. And there's been a really intense engagement over the issue of slavery. And what he argued is that it signals, as it did in the 1830s and the 1960s, it signals a crisis in American race relations that necessarily elevates the significance of the study of the past as we continue to search for remedies to bring about greater social justice in this country. And this argument is an important one, and I don't have time to fully outline all of it today, but let me just make a few of some of his points. About this sort of increasing interest in slavery studies, first in the academy, then in the media, and now more recently in American politics. One need only look at the furor around the New York Times 1619 project, which came out in 2019, to see how much attention the issue of slavery and race still impact our contemporary culture and politics. We should also note that the focus of the really reaction to the 1619 project was not to the two articles that were in that project that focused on our healthcare system and on the history of medicine specifically. There's very little commentary about both of those articles. And I think it's because they both represented a situation that we all sort of recognize, that there are deep health inequities in the United States. But I think the reason, also another reason why those articles weren't questioned is because that's normalized. We expect that. And so this is also recognized in terms of the impact of many apologies for slavery, including newspapers such as the Hartford Courant, which is one of the nation's oldest newspapers. They apologize for advertising the fact that they published advertisements of slaves, and they apologized in 2000. So we're in this period where there's been this sort of increasing efforts to come to terms with this issue of slavery. But what also Berlin noted is that it's rare for Americans to engage their history with such insistence and such persistence. The past has not been of great concern to the American people, and specifically in professions like medicine. For most of the 20th century, discussions of slavery were excluded from public presentation and played no visible role in American politics and culture. But what this explosion, I would say, of interest that continues, that has continued for the last 20 years and is revealed, that is a part of why this project became so important, was that what Berlin argued, he said, was simply put, American history cannot be understood without slavery. Slavery shaped the American economy, its politics, its culture, and its fundamental principles. And for most of American history, the society of the mainland colonies and then the US, as he notes, was one of slaveholders and slaves. And I think this is part of what gets ignored when people continue to say, why these are things that happened in the past, they don't have any impact on us. And I think they are particularly focusing on just the issue of who was enslaved and who did the enslaving, but not the deeper, more complex sets of ways in which the institution of slavery shaped our understanding of who we are as citizens of the United States. And I think also that what we ought to think about in terms of what has happened in the past is that we have to recognize the problem. And it's, as W.E.B. Du Bois said, one of our most important and pervasive social problems is racism. And racism is founded on the institution of slavery. Any attempt to address the question of race in the present must also address slavery in the past. So many examples are coming to the fore. Wynn mentioned some earlier today, David's mentioned some of them. And that is really, many of those examples are tied to the growing study of health disparities. We are finding nearly daily how ideas about innate differences between Blacks and whites and Latinos and Asian populations and other populations in the increasingly diverse United States are shaped by medical practitioners who take for granted the ways in which ideas about differences between racially designated groups in the United States the ideas that people are using to do their work are actually rooted and emerged in the time of slavery. The oft-repeated idea that Black people experience pain differently than whites is just the tip of the iceberg. As medical practitioners and researchers struggle to understand the origins of many health disparities, many roads lead back to slavery and the immediate aftermath in the period of Reconstruction. And those are simply the facts. And I think understanding that and understanding origins of health disparities is what is key here for why the study of what happened during the period of slavery, Reconstruction, and the evolution of slavery practices into the 20th century, as in the establishment of Jim Crow laws and all of that, have shaped medical theory and practice today. So we can't redress the flaws that we're finding in those practices and those theories without returning to this period of origin. Uncovering how slavery and race were continually remade is central to the project of freeing slavery in the United States from a set of stereotypes that have bound it. The journal participated in the ways in which certain articles, the selection of certain articles is perpetuated the stereotypes about slavery that we're trying to address. It needs to be much more complex if we want to engage in redress. That's one of the things that can happen now. And further with respect to health disparities, one of the things that I don't think we saw very much of were critiques of particular ideas about racial differences in the journal. And those critiques, of course, began often by African-American physicians and public health practitioners in the late 19th century into the 20th century. There's, and of course, one that comes immediately to mind is W.E.B. Du Bois's Health and Physique of the Negro American and the Philadelphia Negro, where the basic ideas about how statistics were collected, how the very notion of who was white, who was Black, what these racial categories actually meant, were actually raised by Du Bois and other African-American health practitioners at the time. The critiques were not given the same kind of status as the articles that asserted racial differences. And so moving forward, I think, into what we are trying to confront today is the need to pay more attention to the critique of received ideas about racial difference that have not actually received as much attention as the basic ideas themselves. So put differently, how did we get here? And what forces and practices in medical education, clinical and research training, regulation of hospitals, health insurance, politics, federal health policy, general health services, and public health practices made the striking successes of US medicine alongside the striking disparities. the acknowledgement of this situation, that we have striking successes, innovative technologies and all of that. At the same time, we have deeply embedded inequities and inequalities that we do absolutely need to address if we move toward a more just society. We have to acknowledge, as Berlin did in his paper over 20 years ago, the connections between the past and the present. And that's, I think this work that we've done is a clear example of the value of doing so, of acknowledging the connections, to making sure we understand the past as a deeply complex period of time that enabled some of the things we have in the present that serve us and enabled the things that do not serve us.
Excellent, thank you. Berlin.
I just want to make sure this microphone works. All right, terrific. So my paper, as David said, was about the 1960s civil rights movement and how it impacted the journal, and also how the journal in turn affected the civil rights movement in the medical care sector. And so my big overall question was this: was the journal a cue giver or a cue taker? So by cue giver, I mean, is the journal taking a bold minority position that's kind of ahead of its time? And by cue taker, I mean the journal more just kind of reflecting a zeitgeist that has already preceded it. So I first covered the early phase of what you might call a medical civil rights movement, which really was tackling two key issues. One was Jim Crow in medicine, that is segregated facilities. And the second was racial exclusion in state and medical societies, state and local medical societies, excuse me, again in the Jim Crow South. And these state and local medical societies were pretty critical at the time to physicians' livelihood when it came to patient referrals or hospital privileges and so forth. And many of them were racially exclusionary. So I examined how the journal was both a cue taker and a cue giver in this era around these two key issues. So it was a cue taker in that by itself, it did not by any means spearhead efforts around these causes or prod and try to galvanize its readers to support them. But it also did have what you might call a quasi-cue giver role too, because it opened up some of its pages to cue givers. It published letters from actual civil rights activists on the ground who described protest efforts. There was an article by a Minnesota physician and activist who celebrated civil rights activism that was swelling across the nation, and he highlighted how hospital desegregation movements were beginning to actually bear fruit in the federal courts. And soon that momentum he described would be followed by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned discrimination in private and public accommodations. Now, after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there arises an implementation issue. So it's one thing, as we all know, to have a piece of legislation. It's another to actually enforce it. And here, the journal does take on a more proactive cue-giving role. It actually published an editorial admonishing the American Medical Association for doing nothing to rein in those state and local medical societies that continued to actively discriminate despite this new federal law. And that agitation actually culminated in a successful effort to get the AMA to finally crack down, partially in response to a resolution that was introduced in the AMA meeting by the Massachusetts Medical Society, which publishes the journal. The second phase that I outline is a bit more complicated, and it did kind of mirror some of the tensions within the broader civil rights movement later on. So you do get a societal consensus that just blatant discrimination is wrong. At the same time, many activists also begin arguing that combating racism has to be more than simply banning the most flagrant forms of racial discrimination. So in other words, basic equal protection is hugely important, but it's not enough. Racism is seen as a much broader social system that needs to be attacked. And so the journal at this time publishes fascinating pieces along these lines, but they are by other people. So it's kind of a cue-taking role. There are articles on how Harvard Medical School's expansion bulldozed or would bulldoze the property of primarily low-income African-American neighbors. There are vigorous defenses of what would become known as affirmative action and other intentional ways of rethinking admissions so that more Black physicians could enter a profession that historically excluded them. There are articles extolling the virtues of non-physician community participation in the administration of medical services. And there are passionate polemics about the impacts of pervasive racial segregation and ghettoization on the quality of medical services in such areas. But the journal here also is more equivocal than it was when it was simply fighting hospital and medical society discrimination. So what it would often do with articles like the ones I just described is it would also run kind of like a counterpoint to those articles. So on that medical expansion stuff, it ran an article by Harvard professor Francis Moore defending expansion projects. And Moore argued, quote, that the inconvenience of a few people was a small price to pay for the long-range good of many. On community participation, a Harvard physician published an article that was a little nervous and skeptical about non-professionals being involved in medical administration. And on affirmative action, the journal ran a notorious piece by Harvard professor Bernard Davis, who argued that affirmative action policy had resulted in supposedly unqualified Black medical students who would pose a danger to future patients. So in broader society at the time, there's no social consensus on where to go next with the problem of racism in the United States. And I would argue maybe that's our situation today as well. And in microcosm, that's very much reflected in the pages of the journal during this latter phase. To conclude, I have 4 quick takeaways from this. First, when broader societal consensus towards something, whether it's anti-discrimination and its virtues, its moral virtues in the 1960s, or the perilous health effects of climate change today, when that's starting to form that kind of consensus, journals like the New England Journal of Medicine can play a huge legitimating role by taking a strong editorial stand that can be then very consequential in a sector like ours. It has influence and it can be deployed. But second, when consensus like that does not exist, but the issue seems to be of paramount importance, I think the journal can also play a critical role by opening its pages to unusual perspectives, including those of activists or those sympathetic to them. And it did that through the story I just told in the civil rights era. Third, when not only is there no consensus over a particular issue, but also extreme dissensus and fracture around some issue, a journal like the New England Journal of Medicine, I think, is actually in a tough position that is worth registering. It, on one hand, has a very heterogeneous readership. It has to cater to multiple disciplines, subdisciplines, specialties, and ideological and policy orientations, and so forth. And so if it takes a stand when opinion on a particular issue is still very fragmented, I think that's actually a very tall order. But it could also follow the examples I've given of a partial cue giver role, including offering its pages not just to its own editorials necessarily, but also to points and other points that would reflect that the issue is in flux and that it has yet to achieve consensus. So it could be kind of like a discourse facilitator. And then finally, number 4, I'd encourage those who are displeased with the journal's quietness on certain issues or think it should take a stand on this or that issue to actually recall what really made the journal shift, at least in the civil rights era. It was not the journal itself, or if it was, that was the actual people editing the journal, I think, were secondary to that. It was fundamentally the tumult and the activism going on outside the journal offices that then pressured it and other elite institutions like it, universities, medical schools, the judiciary, Congress, to then respond. And so I think if you really want to change something like the pages in a banner elite journal, the most effective long-term thing to do is to actually change the conditions in which it exists. You turn the societal dissensus around a topic to societal consensus. But in the meantime, you can also prod it to try to be more of a cue giver too. All right.
Okay, we have time for a couple quick questions before the final panel. Yes, in the back.
So, Lachlan Faro, sorry. Three comments, first two diagnostically, and then the third sort of interventions. But first, just thank you all for all of this and the earlier panelists. Diagnosis. David Williams, who many of you know, last summer as part of the work that the National Academies are doing in updating Unequal Treatment Revisited, said in looking back on why so little progress has been made, and now it's 22 years, he said he's concluded that the fundamental gap is what he called the empathy gap. And then last week at the School of Public Health, when I was asking him and Daniel Dawes about this, he traced that back to W.B. Du Bois. He said the peculiar indifference the vast majority of Americans have to the suffering of people based on color of skin or injured. So how do we understand more deeply the empathy gap, or to the extent that's true? Second, Professor Krieger here has taught almost all of us, when we see something that is morally unconscionable, ask who benefits from this, including who's benefiting from 22 years of very little progress. And then the third, given whatever those diagnoses are about empathy gap and who's benefiting and how that stays, we get into questions of interventions and power and those things, and how do we make sure that we are engaging in interventions that are effective in actually narrowing these unacceptable gaps. So I don't expect simple answers to all of those, but love some thoughts.
So I really appreciate that question. I think that the empathy gap is right, and returning to the period where Du Bois is doing his work, late 19th century, early 20th century, is really important. But also, we had a discussion about some of these issues at the American Association for the History of Medicine meeting recently. And I was struck by a comment that I found that I sort of built some of my remarks around. There's a way in which many physicians understood that African-American peoples in this country were living amid a socioeconomic environment, staggering poverty, that actually was conducive to the production of certain kind of the really overburdened by disease. They could see it, but there's something about the ways in which those practitioners made themselves ignore what they saw right before them. And that may be part of what David is referring to about the production of the empathy gap. And so that turning away from what was right in front of their faces by generations of American white physicians really relegated African Americans into a world that Jim Jones said locked them within a prison of sickness. The inability to see, and why that big blind spot, if you want to call it that, emerged, is part and parcel of what we have to come to terms with. Certainly was documented in Unequal Treatment, and it will be documented again in the revised version of this. So something happened, and Jim Jones went on to say something was lost from the sense of horror and urgency with which physicians had defined disease. The result was a powerful rationale for inactivity. If that is a lack of empathy, I think that is a good explanation of a lack of empathy. But I think the question before us is that lack of empathy was produced by certain practices and policies. And now what do we do to bring back that sense of empathy is really at the heart of what we need to do now, and hopefully some kind of road to get to that.
One question up the front, and then we'll go back to the final panel.
Thanks so much for this. I appreciate your framing around Q giving versus Q receiving. And that kind of ties to your mention, though, about being surprised that the journal was willing to let you reveal the skeletons in the closet, but these are all the publications. The skeletons in the closet would be the peer review process.
Sure.
There would be all the input from that. So I'd be curious if the journal is ever willing to reveal that.
So we can get an update on this shortly. The historians have asked that question repeatedly, and for many years, I think still currently, but for many years, the journal's policy was to shred its archive as the greatest way to ensure the integrity of double-blind peer review, the peer review process. And so our understanding is that there is not an archive that would reveal those considerations. We have a list of editors and editorial staff. You can pull that off the masthead. Some of those people as individuals have left material that's in the Countway archive. So someone like Joseph Garland, who is one of the most important editors, from mid-40s through the mid-60s, does leave a paper trail in Countway, which is totally fascinating. But in terms of the inner operations, like when the journal would publish an article by Knott, like any historian would ask, why are they going out of their way to reach into the Southern medical literature and publish this explicitly and proudly racist work? Like, why were they doing this? We have found no sources that would answer that kind of question. So that's very frustrating. The Q giving, Q receiving role, what language does the journal allow its authors to use is a really interesting question. I don't have a good sense, and Scott, I don't know if you know, like when the journal started copy editing. I suspect certainly under Garland they had. Peer review goes back to the 1930s.
I mean, generally, we know that during the early 1900s, Morris Fishbein talks about doing that and talks about how to do that. I don't know for each of that when they start doing it.
But certainly the kind of language that the journal uses itself in its editorials and allows its authors to publish contributes to this kind of empathy gap. It'd be hard for someone to be immersed in these articles and not emerge with some kind of disdain, as Joe's language, and it's just slanderous writing. And when physicians are reading slanderous writing day in, day out, it's hard to imagine that didn't contribute this. Okay, so we have one last panel. Okay, all the speakers that squeeze in at the table. Eric, if you could join us, I'll turn it over to Joan.
So we stay.
Okay.
We stay there.
We stay here? Yeah, you say, slide down, get more people.
Everyone stays, we're just getting very close together.
Joe, can you slide down a bit more?
So wonderful. Thank you for a rich discussion, and we have not a lot of time, but I think an important part of this is, what does this mean? Okay, and what does this mean for the journal going forward? And we heard a little bit about this is not the end. This is not even the beginning. This is not even the beginning of the end. We could go all the way down that path, but Eric Rubin is up here now, and I think this is the appropriate time to turn to it. What does this mean to the journal?
Well, let me start off by saying that I don't want to speak for the authors, as David said in the introduction, they speak for themselves, and we deliberately didn't want to. So I'm here as a reader more than as a contributor to this series, and really appreciate all their efforts and the efforts of our staff. Are the editors you've heard, our production staff, particularly Debbie Molina. You know, if you look back in our pages, Joan, and look at treatments for just about anything published in the 1800s, the answer was leeches. And now we think leeches are not as effective. So what do you do about that? How do you fix that? Well, we all the time have people requesting corrections to articles, and we are right now dealing with corrections to an article 20 years ago that is published about a drug that's no longer in use, no longer available, in fact. So what's the right way to do this? Should it be to correct? Well, it isn't the particularly good way, because if we went back to every article and said, editor's note, we don't actually think that leeches work, no one sees that. It just isn't, it doesn't get surfaced. The right way to change things is to publish something new. And so I think that was part of our motivation here, is to say, we can't just go back and say we were wrong about this, we were wrong about that. Instead, we want to surface all of these issues. Our group of authors here did a tremendous job of that. Their concept and their work let us approach some of these things. So I think that when it comes to dealing with history, just as dealing with a medical procedure, the best thing we can do is publish again, and publish something that reflects on the record, or corrects the record, rather than just go back and trying to change history.
Thank you. So for the authors, what has your participation in this meant to you? What is it that you're hoping is going to come out of this?
I'm happy to start.
Perfect.
Or unless we're going down.
No.
This exercise actually reminded me a lot about a moment I had teaching a required history of public health class to entering masters in public health students, where I teach at a public health school. And I have a unit where I tell them that all the statistical methods they are going to learn, unfortunately, many of them were eugenicists who had repellent views. And some of these statistical methods were also used in service of these repellent views to give them scientific veneer. But I always say at the very end, the purpose of this was not just to dump on public health and make you all cynical. And I don't want you to leave this just saying, public health is a racist dumpster fire and, there's nothing, I don't want cynicism and fatalism. And so I worried a lot about that. I said, well, why do I think it's important to include a unit on that and not just talk about the triumphs of sanitation and bacteriology and so forth? Why is it so important for me to have a unit or two on that? And I think it's really cultivating reflexivity and self-awareness, so that when the new scholarship is produced, whatever flavor it is, people have that instinct, like, what are my biases? What are my underlying assumptions here? How does my particular the very person I am, how might that influence how I frame issues? Even though those seem like 101 kind of basic things, the number of people who don't do this is very high, I think, in our field. So if there's one thing this series can accomplish, if it cultivates reflexivity and kind of intellectual self-awareness, I think it has succeeded.
Others?
I'll just briefly say that as we think about remedy and repair, I'm still drawn back to the report about Dr. Wama Naonk, who was, denigrated for speaking in his language at graduation at the medical college in Geneva, New York. One thing I wonder about is in terms of a historical project, in terms of a representational project, because I can't imagine that the New England Journal or American Medicine even can really take us too far down the road of remedy and repair for enslavement and dispossession. But in terms of representational issues, I wonder about a series of historical articles, it's very short, but that are some biographies of some of these pioneers, indigenous people who, against every odd, not just survived, but became physicians, 100 years ago, whether it's Carlos Montezuma or Charles Eastman. And, Charles Eastman has a direct descendant, Victor Lopez Carmen, who's going to graduate next month from Harvard Medical School. So, there are some stories to tell that I just think would be interesting, as a way to counterbalance the legacy of this history.
Yeah, I would echo all the above, including Roland's notion about reflexivity and humility, that nobody in the 19th century was setting out to create the New England Journal of Racist Medicine. Everyone thought they were on the right side of history per se, and it's humbling to read this and to reflect on it, and to see the origins of contemporary inequities in this long history. And the fine thing is that it's all hidden in plain view. New England Journal of Medicine, to its credit, not only permitted this, but did the actual digitization that allows anybody with access to the journal to put in these full text searches and to do this kind of research. it's right there for anyone else to continue this work. And there's a lot of work that can continue from this.
Evelyn?
Well, I guess what I want to say is I want the same thing that W.E.B. Du Bois wanted. I want justice. I want students to walk out of the classroom not cynical, not just reflective, but to say, to live up to what I think are the greatest aspirations of people who came before us, which was to have good healthcare be a key aspect of citizenship for everybody in this country and for peoples of the world. I want justice. So I want them to come out furious, challenging received notions, questioning everything, and trying to move forward to ensure the health of everybody.
David?
One quick thing I will add is that when you're sensitized to these kinds of issues and this language issues from reading the history where it's very stark, it's hard not to notice subtler echoes of that exist in the medical literature today. And the one that strikes me, and I've worked on this with some medical students and published some analyses, is the number of articles that still continue to divide the human population into Black versus white, as if that was a scientific or evidence-based thing to do. And it's neither of those, and yet it's pervasive in medicine. It has deep roots in systems of chattel slavery and settler colonialism. Does that mean that everyone who publishes a Table 1 patient demographics that uses Black, white, does that mean they're actively racist people? No, it doesn't mean that. It just means that these old patterns of thought are so deeply embedded into our medical thinking that those are the habits that people fall back to. And I think if we could sensitize more people to this, I mean, you could imagine there's a role that journals could play. I don't think the journal could impose a policy starting July 1st. It will no longer publish an article that stratifies simply into Black versus white. But I think a journal could say, you all have 5 years notice, speaking to the medical research community. Going forward, we want to fix this problem. We realize there's a long lead in because stuff we're publishing now was studies that were started 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So we're going to give you a 5 or 10 year warning. But going forward, you authors and researchers need to do a better job with these kinds of issues. And if a bunch of journals were willing to flex their muscles and do that, if NIH were willing to do that and say, we're not going to fund grants that continue to use stupid categories to parse human diversity, change could happen. And so we hope that by focusing on these egregious examples from the past, which are the low-easing fruit to critique, that will then provide a precedent for people to recognize the subtler but pervasive problems that remain in hopes that change happens.
Megan?
Yeah, I want to continue doing the research that I've been doing to really get to the roots, at least the HMS faculty who are involved and what they did, and hopefully encourage people to go to their archives, go to the places where these documents live. Everything I used was publicly available. So really encourage people to go out and investigate when they have questions, because these documents exist and they're fascinating. So,
it's for me, it's interesting as you talk about this cultivating reflexivity, intellectual self-awareness, questioning or challenging old patterns of thought. How do you move from a series of perspective articles to creating a culture and environment that cultivates reflexivity? It's one thing to put the articles here, but how do you move from just having them to actually taking the message that you're giving and putting it into action?
Joan, are you asking a question about education? Because if you're asking a question about education, I think there needs to be more forums like this where we actually talk about what's in the journal and what we're doing around these kinds of things. And then we need to change the curriculum 100%.
It could be education. I'm not limiting to education. I'm just saying just having the article by itself may not be enough to move to that space of reflexivity. Exactly.
So I think that the articles exist in an ecosystem. I think these are the most striking examples of thinking about not only historical injustices, but current issues around equity. One thing that we've been doing, and again, Debbie and Steve, to their full credit for this, is publishing case studies of what's worked for people in approaching equity problems. It's a very different something that we've never done before, but I think some of them are very illuminating. I think we have to continue to experiment around this in the journal. Are we done ever publishing anything on historical injustices? Yes. No, that's not true. I'm quite certain that we will be publishing more, that we will have more authors approach us, that the current group of authors might have other ideas. And David mentioned a couple of upcoming ones that came in over the transom rather than being initiated by David and the group of authors. So I think that as a journal, what we can do is publish more, and we should. This is an important area of health, and ignoring issues of fairness, ignoring issues of equity. Doctors have to care for their patients who come from all of these different communities, and we have to define how that care should be provided. And so I think it's core to our mission.
With that, and Evelyn, you talked about education, you talk about some of the, maybe I would frame it as not doing what we've always done, but what else do we need to do? So you've talked about maybe case studies. Joe, you've mentioned maybe actually telling the stories behind some of these individuals and experimenting and doing things in new ways. You talked about, you talked about this potential of putting out something saying that maybe you just can't do black, white forever. And maybe you need to do things in a different way, or help explain how you ended up with this and justify it. And if you can't justify it, does it really belong in a journal is what I would ask the question. Does it belong there?
John, if I can just address that, because it is a problem we talk about all the time. Race is a social construct. And so what are we doing putting a social construct into the pages, as David says? The problem is there are huge inequities between people who self-identify as Black and people who self-identify as white. And we don't have much that's better right now. We don't have genetic categories to put people into that would say something about their genomes. We don't have social categories to put people in to say they came from the wrong side of the tracks and they didn't have the opportunities that others do. And I think we're really struggling with that. So, but it ends up by enforcing the black-white thing, and we do to some extent. We actually ask authors now to explain why they were not, why their studies weren't representative of the disease distribution in the population. We'd love to have something better, and we are very open to hearing what that is. We want to do better, but we're
And I would
stuck.
say that's part of a challenge for those of us in this room. That's part of a challenge. And so it's not just we're the recipients of this, but how do we actually engage in thinking about how we might respond to this? Nancy? A microphone is coming.
The moment anyone studies anybody that's a person, there are social phenomena at play in their health status. We're not just biological beings, we're simultaneously social and biological beings, and we come with a historical background that is both our own life from when we were conceived and then everything that comes before that. So I don't think it's a choice of saying it's a problem that there's a social construct. And there is, at least in my field of social epidemiology, a ton of work that is about how you start to bring in measures of inequities, about looking not only what the metrics are to how you compare one group to another, but what the social group definitions are, requiring clear definitions of those social groups, whether they're constructed in relation to things tied to histories of racism, tied to histories of settler colonialism, tied to histories of gender systems, systems around sexuality, et cetera, and also class, which is, there's plenty of good, very good variables people can use, and there's repositories of what those variables are around socioeconomic position, not understood only at the individual level, but also the contextual measures that can be brought in. So there's a repertoire of what's available, and I think that what journals can require more, I mean, I find problematic. Some of the journal requirements, not so much, like JAMA, for example, tells you that you cannot use the term race/ethnicity. You only have to use race or ethnicity, which misses how it actually plays out in the US. And I've gotten around that by using racialized group, which I think is something which also gives a sense of what somebody has created these groups. They're not just facts of nature. So there are ways that the language matters, but I think, Joan, to your question, it's not just about correcting historical inaccuracies and facts. It's thought systems that are tied to systems of injustice, as Evelyn has been speaking to, and as Joseph has been speaking to, about we need to grapple with those for what they mean for contemporary as well as past health inequities. But it's not, to me, that hard to understand that we need to have a framing that always puts people as being social and biological simultaneously. There are some things, it is true, carbon monoxide poisoning would have killed you 3,000 years ago and it would kill you now. That's just the fact of being the kind of biological creature we are. But the patterning of health and the inequities of health, those are dynamic, those change, and we need to know who's exposed to what and why, again, at whose expense, for whose benefit. And those are just questions that just should be standard to ask, and they actually have been standard. They've just not been the dominant questions.
Which leads me to thank the New England Journal, thank David for bringing this forward. All too often, we get these ideas of something and we leave them alone as opposed to pushing them forward. To thank the authors for the work that you have done and continue to do, and for challenging us. To thank the audience for continuing to challenge us. There is so much more for us to not just understand, but to change in our thinking, to cross disciplines, to not assume that because it's in writing, it's true or it's right. And so thank you. Thank you for bringing us here today. Thank you for all you have done. Thank you for what will come out of this in the future. So as I'm looking out and I'm seeing students and fellows and others who are earlier in their career, keep pushing, keep challenging, keep asking questions, because that's the only way we're going to get real change. Again, thank you all for being here today.
Thanks for doing it. Yeah. Thanks a lot.